Today's lecture is going to focus on rhetorical style. Now, just a little reminder on style before I discuss rhetorical style. Last time we discussed oral style, which is where you're using colloquialisms, using things like me, personal pronouns, really making it sound like it's a conversation. And then, of course, clear style, where you're not using jargons, you're using simple sentences and breaking down the material for the audience. This is important. We're still going to be using this when we move on to the persuasive speech, but I'll also be introducing a new style, which is rhetorical style. So I briefly mentioned this last time, but to really talk about what it is, it's language that's used to persuade, inspire, influence, which of course is why we didn't talk about it in the informative speech. Mainly what it breaks down to is language that's more poetic, right? It's going to have more influence because there's a beauty to that language, and of course rhetorical devices, things like repetition, metaphors, imagery. Those are only some. There's actually a lot of rhetorical devices, and don't worry, I'm not going to cover all of them in this lecture. So let's start talking about how the rhetorical devices work. Before I can name some of them, you have to understand how the rhetorical devices divide. They're in two different categories. The first is schemes, and the second is tropes. Now, when we're discussing schemes, what it's going to break down to is the syntax. Basically, how is the sentence constructed? And an easy way to kind of think of that is rhythm. When you read the sentence, it has a really nice sound because the sentence has been constructed in a way to do that. The other one is tropes, and instead of focusing on the sentence, we're focusing on the actual words in the sentence, right? Semantics. And of course, you can think of that as kind of imagery, giving meaning to what's going on in the actual sentence. So schemes and tropes. What I'm going to talk about first are schemes. Now, the four schemes that I'm going to focus on break down into all being focused on repetition, which is a really, really important rhetorical device. Stylistically, you will see speakers and writers use this constantly. So, first one, and this one you might already be familiar with, alliteration. This is when we have a repetition of a sound or particular letters. So, let me give you an example. The dictator of Iraq is not disarming. To the contrary, he is deceiving. So the D's in this sentence of dictator, disarming, and deceiving, those repetitive sounds, is what makes the sentence have a kind of rhythm, right? It sounds really nice. Here's another example. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So again, the repetition of people. So sounds or letters is what we're looking for in alliteration. As opposed to anaphora. This is going to be a repetition not of a sound, but of a word or a group of words together, and they're going to go in the beginning of a clause or sentence. So let me show you what this looks like. Every day, every night, in every way, I'm getting better and better. So notice every, and it's in the beginning of this sentence. Another example, and this is a little longer one, but it's a famous one. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, and you can see the rest of it. But essentially it was. He does it multiple times, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's all over this. So the repetition of a couple of words or word, right? We see word in the first one, but always coming at the beginning, either of the sentence, or here we have multiple clauses listed. That's what we're looking for in anaphora. The next one actually is kind of the opposite of this. This is epistrophe. So instead of the repetition at the beginning, what we're going to see is the repetition at the ending. So what lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny compared to what lies within us. Now, some students get confused because they're like, oh, well, this is one sentence. How is this at the end? Keep in mind, it's clauses or phrases that we're looking for. So what lies behind us, that's one clause. What lies before us, that's one, and our tiny be compared to what lies within us. Here's another example. This is a little bit longer. Then I'll be all around in the dark. I'll be everywhere, everywhere you look. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Whenever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. And when our folk eat the stuff they raise and live in the houses they build, why, I'll be there. So I'm sure you could kind of hear the emphasis just in my voice, I'll be there. That repetition over and over and over at the end of almost every sentence in this particular paragraph. So remember, anaphora is in the beginning, epistrophe is at the end. And then the last one is parallelism. Now, this is focusing more on the grammar of the actual sentence, the actual construction. So we're not just dealing with a couple of words here. So for instance, whether in class, at work, at home, Sarah was always busy. Now the repetition are these particular parts of the sentence because it's using a preposition and then a particular noun, preposition, noun, preposition, noun. So that repetition of that particular structure is really what we're looking for in parallelism. Another example, to err is human, to forgive is divine. So this is actually two different sentences since there's a semicolon here, but same thing, to err, to forgive, right? So they're putting to before it, and then of course is and define. Now, sometimes when I cover these, students kind of feel a little overwhelmed, right? There's 4 different devices on repetition. How the heck do I tell the difference between them? That's a lot. And of course it is. Now here's what to remember. Alliteration is just sounds or letters, right? You can think of like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickles. You know what I mean. Or Sally sold seashells by the seashore. You know what I mean. Okay, that's what typically falls in this. These two over here, anaphora and epistrophe, are dealing with a couple of words or word that is either at the beginning or end. An easy way to remember the difference, anaphora starts with an A, that's the beginning of the alphabet. So what's at the beginning of the sentence? Epistrophe starts with an E, which is the same thing as E in end, so that's at the ending of the sentence. Parallelism has to deal with the actual structure of a sentence. So that's an easy way to kind of keep them all separate in your head. All right, one other scheme we have to talk about before moving on to tropes, and that is antithesis. So antithesis is somewhat similar to what we've been talking about. It does sort of deal with a parallelism, but here we're dealing with two ideas that are completely different. And by the way, too, when it's not a literary device and you're actually using antithesis as a word, it means literally direct opposite. So to give you an example, man proposes, God disposes, give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. So proposes and disposes, obviously two opposite things. And then of course thy ear and thy voice are asserting one is listening while one is talking, which are two opposite things as well. Another example, and this is a really famous quote, setting foot on the moon may be a small step for man, but a giant step for mankind. So here, small step, giant step, those are sort of contrasting each other. All right, to move on to tropes. Now, just to remind you, tropes don't have to do with the setup of the sentence, but the actual words that are being used. So remember, kind of think of imagery, giving meaning to a sentence. And there's two different kinds that I'm going to be covering. The first is metaphor. So metaphor, a lot of people think of this as like a simile without like or as, and yes, that's sort of the traditional definition, but really, what it's doing is kind of asserting that something is something else based on a comparison. That's a much better definition. So for instance, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. So here we're literally talking about this being, the world stage, right? That we're considering life as this sort of drama and people as these players. So that's one way of literally taking that comparison all the way through. Another example, art is a rebellious child, a wild animal that will not be tamed. And I really love this metaphor because you can visualize it, you can see it, right? So that's why a metaphor, I think just saying, simile without using like or as is not enough. It really gives new life almost to the word. You can see art, you can almost feel art in a different way because of this. All right, the last one is rhetorical question. So most of this, people think rhetorical question is a question that's not supposed to be answered. I always find it funny when I tell people that I teach and I study rhetoric. I had someone who once asked me, so you study questions that don't need to be answered? And obviously, no, I do a little bit more than that. I'm sure you guys remember from rhetoric that it's more complicated than that. But a leading question, right? This is really supposed to be something that leads your audience to a particular idea or feeling. That's why it's rhetorical, because it's stylistic in a way. It's not just supposed to be something that's not answered. So, with all the violence on TV today, is it any wonder kids bringing guns to school, right? So this is persuasive, right? I'm clearly taking on a very specific point of view and really trying to get my audience to see that point of view. And of course, this is a lighter one. Why are you so stupid, right? You wouldn't actually answer this question. It's just supposed to be an insult. So, let's see if you can identify the device. So I've covered all of the devices for today. I'm just covering very briefly some of the ones that you will see. There's a lot more, but here's an example. Congress is caught in a hopeless tangle of PACs, perks, privileges, partisanship, and paralysis. So, alliteration, metaphor, anaphora, or rhetorical question. See if you can guess. So this would be alliteration, the emphasis on P, 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 all of that here would make it alliteration. Okay, so that is it. Like I said, I'm only very briefly covering some of the rhetorical devices. There's actually thousands out there. But here's what you need to answer. What is the difference between epistrophe and anaphora? What is the difference between a trope and a scheme? Identify this device. The wheels of justice turn slowly. And last, and this is the most important one since we're continuing to work on your speeches, come up with 2 devices you'll use in your speech. And don't just say, oh, I'm going to use anaphora and rhetorical question. You actually have to work on what you're going to put. You need to list the rhetorical question that you would use or list the anaphora. So really start coming up with creative ways of adding to your speech, because this is going to help you make you a much, much more effective speaker and much more persuasive. So do this, and we will talk a little bit more about style in class.